I'm Sarah Cott, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill, and thank you for joining us today in person and online for Every Mind Matters, the many dimensions of mental illness. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Otsuka, for their support of this wonderful discussion. We are here today to talk about an unprecedented mental health crisis in the U.S. As 2 in 5 American adults reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression in 2001. Fortunately, the country has witnessed a positive sea change in recognizing the importance of mental health and self-care in recent years. But significant work still remains to create a system that recognizes the nuances and needs of those with mental illness, especially the 1 in 20 Americans with serious disorders. How can we break down the stigma associated with mental illness? How can we build comprehensive care systems to support all individuals affected by it? And how is prioritizing mental health intrinsically linked to good health overall? We will discuss these questions and more, but before we get underway, I would ask you all to please put your cell phones on silent in the room, and you can join our program via social media. You can follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, at The Hill, and using our event tag, The Hill Mental Health. And with that, I am delighted to start our program by welcoming Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill, to the stage. He will be moderating a bipartisan chat with Congresswoman Lisa McClain of Michigan and Congressman David Trone of Maryland, co-chairs of the Congressional Task Force on Mental Health and Substance Use Disorder. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Sarah. Let me first, Congresswoman, and we were saying backstage, it's good to have some bipartisanship in these polarizing times. Congresswoman, obviously got to start with a big question. Are we going to get a speaker today?
My crystal ball is completely broken right now. But if I was a betting woman, I would say not today.
Okay. Do you think this week would be... I went on TV and I said this week. I don't know who, but this week.
I would take that bet.
You would take that bet. Okay. I know.
It might be Mr. Trone over here, but who knows?
We hope for the best.
These days, you never know what's going to happen. Right?
Anything could happen.
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, this is a bipartisan event. This is a bipartisan issue. Can you both start off, Congresswoman, with you just why you're here, your connection to this issue? Everyone is affected. Everyone knows people who have gone through some difficult times. And then we can talk about the task force and the bipartisanship.
Quite simply, because it matters. I mean, at the end of the day, it matters. And it matters because, like you said, everyone has been touched by it, right? We all have a family member, a friend. It's out there. And I think if you look at the bipartisan task force, it is one of the few places that is actually a bright spot where we can work in a bipartisan fashion to actually get some stuff done here in DC, right? I think for so long, mental illness has been, had that stigma attached. And it takes folks like Mr. Trone to take the lead and really say, hey, we have a problem, because you can't fix a problem until you first admit you have a problem. And then it takes some hard conversations and some tough legislation and to change people's mind, but really to move the ball forward. And I think this task force has done that with the help of folks like you, right? We talk about it now. Whether it's mental illness, whether it's the drug crisis, you name it. But we need to begin to heal from the inside out. And I'm ecstatic to be on the task force. And it's interesting. Whatever side of the aisle I go to and I say, hey, we're doing this for mental health. Oh, I want to help. I want to help. I want to help. It is an issue, unfortunately, but that truly does bring people together. So.
It clearly touches every family in America. 1 in 5 folks have some mental illness in their family. It's a concern in my family. The addiction issue is leading cause of death now, 18 to 45. Fentanyl, number 1 cause. I lost a nephew. He died of an overdose at age 24, so it's personal. So I think that's how the death toll has just mounted. Over 1 million folks have now perished to overdoses, and currently the numbers are 80% of that is fentanyl. So that's the killer right now. We went from the oxys and the opioids to the heroin, and now it's fentanyl. And mental health illness runs side by side, and of course justice impacted, and we do a lot of work on justice. Folks that are justice impacted, all three are just connected together.
Yeah.
So, Congressman, when you talk to mental health leaders and constituents on this issue, what are you hearing, and what are some of the solutions to the obstacles?
Well, the biggest issue we have right now is lack of mental health providers and/or addiction specialists. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, and we've tried to put in literally hundreds of millions of dollars to drive folks for loan forgiveness, to get folks, especially in rural areas and the urban areas. That's where you can't find a psychiatrist, you can't find a therapist, and they're certainly not going to take your insurance. They're going to only be paid, right on the spot. So a real shortage of folks in our schools, our prisons. There's just nobody that we can find to work in those jobs because the pay is too low and it's a tough job.
Congressman, what are you hearing?
I would concur. I spend a lot of time in the high schools, and the issue that I see most prevalent, and there are a lot of issues, but the issue that I see most prevalent is let's talk about COVID, right? It is what it is. Kids weren't in school, they weren't socialized for a little while. Whether you agree with that or disagree with that, it is irrelevant. The issue is that's the fact, and that's what happened. So now these children, they go back to school, right? And there's one counselor for maybe 250 children. Okay, let's even say in some of the best schools, 100. How is that one counselor supposed to deal with those 100 children? And those counselors have to do everything from class schedules to getting them ready for college to mental health. It's just a daunting task. So I think we have to get to the root of the cause, right? Whether you look at the prison system, whether you look at the addiction system, if you peel that onion back, it comes back to mental health. And a lot of times if we can get to those root issues, which I think starts in the schools, I think we're onto something. So we have to funnel more money. Yes, I'm a Republican. Oh my God, did you just hear? Don't quote me on that, I won't get reelected. But I'm dead serious, and I say that. We have to care about the mental health, and you know what? It comes back to money.
Every dollar we put in to addiction treatment, mental health treatment, we get $12 returned.
Yes.
1 to 12.
Yes.
So we underinvest in our most precious resource, our children.
Yes.
That's what we're all here for,
Yeah.
the next generation, and we don't spend money smartly,
Yeah.
and then we pay for it on the back end.
Right. And I'm not saying that that's an end-all, be-all, but, we know the problem, right? If we can catch the problem early, maybe we can correct 80% of the problem.
But
it costs money.
And one big positive is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has $3 billion. That's the first time the federal government's made a major investment. It's in 12 different programs. 3 of the big programs are 2 of the $3 billion. Then there's 9 more grants after that. But that hasn't rolled out yet as DOE finishes up how they're going to distribute it. But that's going to be a game changer for our educators and our students both. Because let's think about our educators too, because they're in the same boat and with all those same stressors.
You mentioned the task force, you mentioned legislation. Did that legislation come out of the task force? There are a lot of caucuses and task force on Capitol Hill. Honestly, a lot of them don't do anything. But you guys actually have a proven track record where you've introduced over 100 bills. You've gotten, I believe, 26 into law. Tell us about the task force and how it works.
Yeah, last session we got 26 bills passed the law. And our key is everything's going to be bipartisan. Bipartisan, that's the key. And this is such a pleasure to work together. And everybody really pulls together. And that's what I like about it a lot. But the big dollars on mental health came out of a concept in appropriations. And we had $1 billion in the appropriations budget in '23 for mental health and K-12. Then President Biden took that concept when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and he tripled it. And now what we've got to do is make sure we continue to fund it. We can't send our schools unfunded mandates like we did with IDEA, which should have been funded at 40%, and the best we've ever funded is 14.25%. So
I was high on 17.
you were pretty close.
And now there are some indications the Senate may follow your lead. There's possibly a bipartisan. What do you know about that?
You know, I'm encouraged, right? And what you'll find is the Senate will follow if we prove concept, right? Proof of concept. And I think you kind of humbled yourself. How many bills did we put into law last year?
26.
Think about this. Just grasp this. 26 into law. That means the House, the Senate, and the President signed it. 26. That is no small feat. And it's led by this man right here, and I don't think he takes enough credit for that. And you really are doing a remarkable job. And I think because of that, the Senate is now taking notice. And I believe you'll see a lot more getting done in the Senate.
We talked about children. Obviously, everyone is affected by COVID, but children really affected.
Yeah.
What has been the effect of that, in both a positive and negative way? It seems like now we're more open to talking about a sensitive topic than we used to, but COVID obviously set a lot of kids back.
Well, I think the negative is kind of apparent, right? We're social animals. We like to be socialized, right? The other thing is when the children were in their home and they couldn't socialize with their friends, where did they go to socialize? That's horrible. I mean, the internet, all that social media, right? But that was a negative that came out of it. I think the positive that came out of it, at least for me, I have a lot of rural districts. Rural communities, in my district. And we did a lot of telehealth. And mental health, right, was a big positive because before you'd have to drive 2 hours if you could even afford it, right? But now you could get on the internet and you could do a Zoom mental health meeting. I get it's not perfect and it's not as good as sitting down one-to-one, but it's a heck of a lot better, which really woke people up to, wow, we really have a problem. And although this isn't a perfect scenario, the telehealth, on a positive note, has really been influential in changing people's mind, but also getting people in the rural communities like I represent.
Yeah, we both come out of a pretty rural area. I go the whole way out to Garrett County. It's a 4-hour drive, from Montgomery County where my district starts. So that rural area, their number one issue is addiction, and it's like West Virginia, it just creeps over into my district, up into Michigan. So that telemental has been key, game changer. But the other big game changer coming is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, $65 billion to broadband. That's going to change America, and that's going to let us do better telemental, telehealth. The only way we can bring drug costs down is telehealth. And that's what broadband bill is going to do for us and really help bring America together and let folks live in a rural spot and have the benefits of better pay for a job in an urban area.
Agreed.
And I imagine you have to remind people who live in urban areas that internet is not everywhere, and there needs to be an investment in that, because in the Acela corridor, you tell people, like, wait a minute, doesn't everyone have internet or strong internet? And that's not the case. And that puts a lot of kids at a disadvantage, right?
Yeah, we're probably 40% of the kids in my district, Washington, Allegheny, Garrett County, had no good internet reliable at their homes. I'm sure similar.
But again, I know that was a major negative during COVID, but it really exposed the need for broadband.
Yeah.
Local initiatives are very important. Congresswoman, you founded the North End Support Team in Macomb County. Tell us about that.
So I'm very proud of that organization, but it's a very embarrassing story for me. And I say it because one of my best friend's son died from an opioid overdose. You know, he's your typical, we all have it, high school football player, you know, has a shoulder injury, gets hooked on opioids, et cetera, et cetera. I thought, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm part of the problem, I thought that all the drug addicts were living under a viaduct in the inner city. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that, but that's the honest to God's truth, and if we can't start with the truth, then we're not gonna make any progress. Until it happened to me. I didn't see any of the signs. How could I not see any of the signs? I kind of liken myself to halfway intelligent, and it's like, woo, right? I didn't see it. So I was angry. Make a long story short, I was angry. I don't know who I was mad at. I was just angry, right? I was mad at myself. What do we do about it? Because now, once I opened my eyes, right, it was all around me. I was just too blind to see it. So what do? Well, if you go and you look at the justice system, as you touched on earlier, you know, I don't know the exact percentage in our community, but if you look at the bulk of the people that are in jail, that are incarcerated, has to do with a addiction problem, right? All right, well, what do? We don't lock them up. How does that fix the problem? It doesn't. So I started the drug court in my community, and it started very, very small. And in the first year, we put 18 people through the drug court. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but for our little community, and then every year it grows. And now we're up to, I think last cycle, it was 100 people that went through the drug court that actually broke the cycle. So you have to start with, what do? I'll tell one more little story is if you go to my website and you look at my family, there's one person that doesn't fit in the family. He happens to be 6'7" and African American. I'm 4'11". I don't know if you noticed, I'm sitting down, so it's hard to tell. But right under my nose, we had the funeral at my house, or the wake at my house, and Barrett, my son, came to the wake, and it was, you know, everyone's kind of having a good time. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and he's crying in the middle, in the corner of my basement. And I said, honey, what's the matter? And he said, Ricky, who is the boy that passed away, he was the only family I had. And I said, well, what do you mean? And I found out that his mother was incarcerated, or is incarcerated, and will never get out. And his dad is homeless on the street. He had no place to go. Now this is right under my nose, and I was too blind to see it. That's why I say it's very embarrassing. So probably the biggest thing my husband and I ever got in, I said, oh, honey, you can come live with us. So the next morning he got up and he said, Miss Lisa, are you serious? And I said, oh, absolutely. Perhaps I should have consulted with my husband prior to that. But he's
Stuff happens.
Exactly.
You know.
But he's been with us now for, I don't know, 12 years? So, yeah.
Fantastic.
That is great. That's great.
And he's a blessing to me. So. Yeah.
Congressman, as far as people who need help, who are watching right now, what advice would you give to them? We do now have a national hotline, but at the local level, what works other than funding?
Well, I'd say the 988 line has been fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And
Great idea.
I don't think anybody quite realizes the deaths that we have in our country by suicide. I mean, that number's just a shy under 50,000 deaths. That's 135 deaths today. Today, 135. Of those, about 28,000 are by firearm. So we could do a lot better there if we put in some different rules and regulations to make sure those firearms weren't available right when that person hit their low point. Because suicide's an impulsive situation, and the firearm is a game closer. So that's a big, big issue. It's a challenge for everybody. And we've also got to continue to connect better on all three things together: addiction, mental health, and of course, the justice piece. And so we've also formed another group, which we're working on, called the Second Chance Caucus. So we went out, we got 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and we're all about getting folks a second chance. Everybody deserves that. We've all screwed up. And so that's, some of those folks have been, as Lisa said, been drug incarcerated, treating drugs like a crime, not a disease, and then we've got to help them get that second chance.
Or third or fourth. Right?
Yes.
Right. Going to open it up to questions as we have a few minutes left. Congressman, just want to ask you, well, both of you, what's the legislative agenda now? You said 26 laws have passed from the task force. I think a lot of people wouldn't have thought 26 laws passed in recent years. So what's on the agenda now?
Well, biggest thing on the agenda right now is get that speaker.
That would help.
Yes, can't do anything
Unfortunately, that's
until
our
that.
fault.
Lisa's going to handle that very shortly. But no, we actually had a press conference maybe 2 weeks ago, and we put out a printed agenda of 70-some bills we have that are out there now running. And so a lot of ideas we had last year, like the Parental Support Act. I did that with Dan Muser, a chance to help folks around the person that's addicted. So like my nephew was addicted, what do? Well, I'm not the first person to deal with that. Let other folks learn from that. And we got to drive MAT treatment also and get that out there, much medically assisted treatment. And we've got to drive research. So I've talked to folks, of course, at NIDA, at ARPA-H. We need big bets on brain research. And that's what ARPA-H has got to do, take big bets, $100 million bets, and we're going to have failure. And when they fail, Lisa and I are going to say, that's okay. Let's take what we learned from that and keep moving. But the research is on addiction and on mental illness. That's tough research.
Yeah.
Let me open it up to questions. We have staff, and if you can identify yourself and ask a short question, if you want to raise your hand.
We did a good job.
Okay, wow, you got an awful lot. Let me ask a follow-up. Will the goal be for some of this legislation, as I imagine the 26 were attached to a must-pass bill, maybe some type of CR or something along those lines?
Obviously, yes.
Okay.
The other thing I think we have to really watch is the flow of the money. Because so many times what I've seen is we pass legislation and $100, for example, starts here. And by the time it gets to the place, where the rubber meets the road, that $100 turns into about 38. I mean, this is critical. These are critical dollars, and you want to talk about a return on investment. I don't think there's a better return on investment than mental health.
Yeah, Lisa's right. The money often gets sort of lost in the distribution, but the state opioid response grants, what I love about that bill is $1.75 billion a year for the next 5 years. We're fully funding appropriations, maybe overfunded even one day. And but the point is that goes right to the states. So the governors can make the decisions, and because they're much more on the ground
Yeah, they're closer.
than we are.
Yeah.
And does the task force, because legislation gets a lot of attention, especially from the political media, but implementation doesn't get as much. Are you guys following how the administration implements those 26 laws very closely?
We have to. I mean, there's no question. We absolutely have to be the good stewards.
And
of
how
the
are they
money.
doing? How is the administration doing? I mean, usually it is delayed. The transportation bill will take many, many years to implement.
Yeah, SAMHSA has really stepped up. I mean, SAMHSA is the biggest group that drives all this area, and they've really stepped up. And President Biden has leaned into addiction, and he's leaned into mental health. I've spoken to him directly about it a dozen times, and his point is real clear. Just like our family and everyone's family, it's affected his family addiction, and mental health has affected his family. It's personal to the president, and he's very much leaned in. And his example sets the tone.
Agreed.
Give you the last word.
I just appreciate Mr. Trone. I think it is a passion, and without you and your work, I mean, it really does matter. It really does matter, and I appreciate all of you all, really taking the time to be here today. It's critical, and if we truly want to break the cycle, we have to start with healing the inside. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. But I also think we have to begin to educate people, right? We need to, when we're at those cocktail parties or those events and we hear people chattering, it really is our responsibility, if we truly care, to insert ourselves in those conversations and correct the truth with the other half of the truth. Don't let me be the example in my ignorance, right? I wish I would have figured this out a lot earlier. I finally did. But we have got to begin to stand up and say, no, hang on. It is not that. It is an illness. And if you truly want to help and you truly want to break the cycle, it starts with us opening our mouth and saying something. Don't sit back silent, and then everybody wants to talk about it, but you got to get involved. You got to help. You got to volunteer, right?
And I'll tell you, the press is really important in this because the more we can talk about it in the press, the more we break the stigma down.
Yes.
And we get folks comfortable saying, hey, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
I'm not okay. And that's a good day. And then we can go from there.
Well, thank you for your perspectives. I know you have a busy day. I know you got to go back and elect Speaker Trone, so I'll let you go. Please thank our representatives. Now we get a firsthand perspective from Gabe Howard. He is the host of the podcast Inside Mental Health and lives with bipolar disorder. He's an author and a speaker. Welcome, Gabe. Hey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, I was reading about your story, and I don't want to get in the way. Why don't you just tell us your story?
So first off, I have to tell, I'm 46 years old, and I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 26. So I have to tell you 26 years in about 1 minute. So here's the rapid TikTok version. First, I was born, everybody thought I was okay. It turns out I wasn't okay. I had bipolar disorder, but nobody knew that I had bipolar disorder. So my parents, upon seeing the symptoms of bipolar disorder, they punished them. It turns out that you can't punish the symptoms of bipolar disorder out of your child. Who knew? So my parents just kept telling me over and over and over and over again, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. Here's the thing, my parents are great people. Story is not about to zag to the left. Mom is good, dad is good. Everybody loved me, right? Listen to this. In the 80s and 90s, we had dinner together as a family. It was basically Norman Rockwell. So I believed them. I thought I was bad. So I entered adulthood. I had no idea that I was sick. But here's the thing. I thought about suicide every day that I could remember. And I thought it was normal. You think there's no robust mental health education now in 2023? There was zero in 1980. Plus, I went to public school. So it was just nothing. So everybody believed that my problem was behavioral. And I got zero help. So when I became an adult, here I am. I have untreated bipolar disorder. I have all of these problems. I have all of these symptoms. And I just think I'm a bad person. So, from this vantage point, I like to say hilarity ensued. But obviously, in those moments, tragedy ensued.
And what worked? I mean, I know that your parents are not bad people. They meant well, but they didn't understand it. And back then, there's no internet, which in some ways is a good thing, right? I mean, but there's good things to the internet too. How did you get through those difficult days?
These are really difficult questions to answer because honestly, I don't know how I got through the difficult days. That bipolar disorder is always thought of in a little bit incorrectly. It's thought of highs and lows, right? You've got your godlike mania and you've got your suicidal depression. But bipolar disorder actually works on a spectrum. Those are in fact the two poles, hence the name. But you can also just end up right in the middle. So I think that there was a lot of protective factors in my life and that my parents did love me. They did care about me. They were there for me. They did check in on me. All of these things really helped avoid loneliness, isolation. They ran interference for me. But also, frankly, there's just dumb luck. Before it got too bad, I would cycle right back to the middle. The middle is the normal, the average, the stereotypical. And these provided protective factors until, of course, the symptoms reared their ugly heads again.
Where did you eventually get support from?
Oh yeah, I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. I was committed to a psychiatric hospital, and there's a long and involved story that we don't have time for. But what I want to be clear is it wasn't my mom and dad that took me. It wasn't my brother or sister, my grandmother or grandfather. It was a stranger. A stranger noticed that something was wrong with me. Not my friends, not my family, not my teachers, not my support, not my coworkers. A literal stranger. And she knew what to do, and she did it. If I had not run into her, I would likely not be sitting here today. It's literal dumb luck that I am here.
And when you were properly diagnosed, what were your thoughts then? Because you had suffered for so many years.
Listen, there's so much censorship that has to come into this, but I really thought holy blank. I'm not sure if I can swear in the National Press Club in Washington. It seems gauche. But
The media never swears.
First off, if you would have asked me an hour before I was committed to a psychiatric hospital if I had mental illness, I would have said no. Because I believed all of the things that society believed, right? People with mental illness, they come from bad families, specifically a bad mother. We just bought hard into that trope. People with mental illness are violent. They're responsible for all the violence, right? They're antisocial. They're drooling and rocking back and forth in a corner. See, that's what I thought mental illness was. So I had no reason to think that I was mentally ill. Frankly, I just thought that I was again, gauche. I thought I was an asshole. Because my parents, they were trying to redirect the symptoms of bipolar disorder, and they had no way to do that. It wasn't going to work. There's no lecture, there's no punishment, but that's what they thought they were dealing with. They thought they were dealing with a teenager. So when this happened, and I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I started reading the pamphlets and talking to people, I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. And in fact, when I told my mother I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, she said, what's that? I read her the pamphlet and she said, oh my God, I always called you my Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde child, which of course is a perfect analogy for bipolar disorder that shot right over her head.
And as far as kind of the takeaways of the American healthcare system, we don't have that long to go through it, but obviously, what do you think has been a good thing that's happened in recent years and things that policymakers, like the two we just had, need to focus on?
It really does all come down to money, and it comes down to just a massive restructuring. I have a friend who loves to watch those home improvement shows, where they flip the house, etc. And there's always this house where, usually one a season, where they go in and everybody looks around and they're just like, okay, we're just going to tear it down. We're just going to tear it down and start over because that's how messed up this house is. Maybe we'll pull a couple parts out and save them and incorporate it into the new design, but no, we're done here. In so many ways, we have this with mental health and the safety net, et cetera. We can't even get the same statistics to pop up in the same state in different counties, right? That's what we're dealing with, right? We can't even get a state to have results that are representative across its state, and yet we're trying to figure out if this is working. The biggest thing that I always tell people is I started to be a mental health advocate 15 years ago, and we've done all of these different things. And everybody's patting themselves on the back, and we're all proud, and we've passed legislation, and all of these things are great. And I'm right there. I will go anywhere there's a microphone and food. And I'm on one hand, I'm super happy that it's being discussed, but go back 15 years and look at the suicide rate per capita, and look at it today. Where's the change? If these things are working, why is that number holding steady? It represents failure in my eyes because I'm the number. I'm the number. I need that number to lower as a protective factor for me. But everybody else like, hey, we did the thing and got the points. Okay, can we lower the number?
How can you lower the number?
Hey, listen, I love that question. And here's why I love that question. Because if I could answer it and everybody in this room is like, hey, we talked to a crazy guy at the National Press Club and he's got an idea and we did it, I would wonder what was wrong with America. I don't know.
Right.
And here's the reason that I don't
Fair
know,
point.
because we're not studying it. There are not robust studies on how to do this. And it's somewhat shameful that a patient has to point that out to government agencies. Why are we not looking into this with everything that America has? And we have the finest doctors, the finest people, the most resources, and yet everybody thinks the solution is, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask the bipolar. I appreciate the question, I do, but if we really stop and think about it, the question should be, what study can you reference that shows us what to do? And there's not a lot.
Words matter. We talked about it a little bit before we came up on stage. Detail that, of why, how we talk about this issue is important.
I think that that is such a wide-ranging question. First off, words do matter, but sometimes we take it too far. For example, I say I'm bipolar, and there's always somebody that writes me a letter whenever I give a speech and says, Gabe, you're more than just bipolar. And I always write back, nobody said just. Why did you hear just? That's very interesting. I said I was married, I said I was hungry, and you didn't say that I'm more than just married or more than just hunger. But you hear that bipolar word and everybody's like, oh, you're so much more than that. So I always like to give pause to that. Let's not let our brains fall out when we think about this. People should be able to define their own experiences. Also, nobody lies awake at night and wonders if they're having a mental health crisis. They wonder if they're going crazy. Let's be honest, that we got to use the words that people use. But more to your point in the media, phrases like committed suicide. See, I live with bipolar disorder, which currently has a 15% death rate. Now, we're all friends now, I feel. If I were to die from bipolar disorder, it meant that I died by suicide. Or if we're using the language of our forefathers, I committed suicide. There is no mechanism for me to die from my disease. The disease is removed. I committed suicide. I died by suicide. I took my own life. I ended my life. Where is the he died from bipolar in this conversation? Because ultimately, that's what killed me. But that's often removed from the discussion. And it creates this parallel discussion that maybe I had some sort of choice, or maybe I had some sort of idea in it, or involvement, or I am personally responsible for it. And you know, that's a lot. It's a lot, and it's a difficult conversation to have, and it's a nuanced conversation, because I don't want anybody who is contemplating suicide to believe that they that they can't impact it. But by the same token, if I died from bipolar disorder, I would hate to think that the conversation would be, well, he chose it, so forget it. We're just going to forget about Gabe. He's erased from history, and in fact, it's his fault, and we're mad at him. That's tough. It's tough.
What kind of reaction have you got since you became a mental health advocate?
Well, nobody is more upset than my mother. No, sincerely, a long time ago, I wanted to become a mental health advocate, and I asked my parents. And honestly, I was trying to get my parents to tell me not to so that I could just blame them and just do nothing, right? That's a great out, blame mom and dad. But mom and dad they were on board with it. They're like, no, tell everybody everything, because if it can help another family, then it was worth our family going through it. So I did. And now my mother has said she didn't think I'd get this far, and she wished she would have put some guardrails on it. I feel that that's a fair point, but the reactions are all over the place. From the, oh my God, you're so brave and you're a hero, which I have to say, my ego loves. I do love it. But on an intellectual level, why am I a hero? Because I'm living my life? Because I'm fighting an illness that I have? Because I'm doing what I'm supposed to do to be well? But then let's swing that pendulum back the other way. Here's the real reality. There's only really two choices for people with serious and mental illness. We either don't have our act together, or we got our act together. Where is the phrasing for the people who are heroes, right? Aside from when we speak publicly. And then we're actually heroes for speaking publicly. We're not heroes for defeating serious and persistent mental illness. So the reactions are largely mixed.
Okay.
There are positive reactions and there are negative reactions. The most negative reaction that I get, of course, is that I'm a liar, that I'm a con man, that I'm faking this, and that this is all part of some ruse that Gabe conjured up in order to get all of you to give me all of your money. Also, that I'm in the pocket of Big Pharma, which I will take Big Pharma's money, but I seem to be in no pocket.
But you get a fair amount of that negative reaction.
I get a lot of negative reaction. And again, it's all based on misunderstanding, right? The whole you're bought and paid for by Big Pharma comes from this idea that many patients don't feel that they understand their medications. They don't feel that they're getting enough time with doctors. They don't feel that the medication is doing for them what they want it to do, and they don't understand why it's working. And they have to lash out somewhere. So that is where they lash out. And unfortunately, they start taking innocent bystanders with them. You know, I do take medication, and that is one of the many things that allows me to live well. But of course, I do now run into this open, I just run right into this pole of, okay, well, you're a liar, and you're just trying to help the pharmaceutical companies build customers. this is tough. There is a nuanced conversation that needs to be had here that we don't have even remotely enough time for, even if we cancel everybody else and let me stay.
Well, last question, and it's the most important one. From your experience, and people who are watching this are like, well, you know, maybe I need to talk to somebody. Maybe it's a stranger, maybe it's a family member, but to figure out how they can improve their quality of life. What would you tell them?
So if I was talking to an individual, I would tell them you've got to self-advocate. You've got to advocate for yourself, and you've got to be tenacious, and this is a difficult and long journey. Social media, number one, but also the media, movies, etc. They always portray mental illness as this way. First off, the person is acting erratically, and then somebody says, "Did you take your meds today?" Then the person takes their meds, and then they're a great detective. Right? It's always like that. They become great at something. That's the other side, right? We're either very sick, which is problematic, we're suffering, or we're great artists, we're great detectives, we're amazing at the things that we do, all as this like backdoor gift because of mental illness. So I would tell them that that's just not true. It's going to take a long time. From the time that I left the psychiatric hospital to the time that I reached recovery took 4 years. That's a long time. But if you ask the average person from diagnosis of bipolar disorder to wellness, they'd be like, well, a few weeks, a few months. Right? And then if I was talking to a larger group, just to take the moment, I really want to be clear that when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it was the literal equivalent of my first car being a $120,000 Mercedes-Benz. Right? And I got in the $120,000 Mercedes-Benz at 16 years old, and I drove it around for a couple of months, and I thought, wow, this car sucks so badly that I myself have to advocate on behalf of all drivers everywhere to fix the automobile industry because that's how bad this car is. So you can imagine my surprise when I found out that everybody else wasn't getting $120,000 Mercedes-Benzes as their first car. And then you can imagine my surprise when I found out that some people weren't even getting cars. The best of the best of the best was offered to me, and it was woefully inadequate. So you can only imagine the rural areas, the no health insurance, the no parents, the no money, the no protective factors, the homelessness, etc., and then asking these people to dig themselves up. So I would say that anybody who is diagnosed with serious and persistent mental illness has an incredibly difficult road ahead of them, where success is largely going to be determined by how successful you were when you were diagnosed.
We have run out of time. Please thank Gabe for sharing his story today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Now it's time for our sponsor's perspective portion of our program. Welcome Eli Perez, Senior Director of Patient Advocacy and Stakeholder Management at Otsuka, in conversation with Debra Barrett, Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Otsuka. Welcome. Thank you both.
Good morning, everybody. I can't tell you how delighted we are to be here this morning. It's nice that we get a little short period of time to share our perspective, because the other conversations, and you can tell from the first two this morning, are just so vital and important. They underscore for me what we've been talking about recently, which is that the conversation around mental illness has been shifting. There is a greater willingness to share experiences, to talk about impact, to focus from a policy-making perspective. I mean, the good news last night that we now have a Senate caucus on mental health. That's excellent. That's progress. That shift is really welcome, because how we identify, diagnose, educate, and treat mental illness is a critical need now. You heard, and you've heard many times over, the numbers about the breadth of the incidence. 1 in 5 American adults is suffering from a mental illness. But what we didn't say again today is more than half of those people are not getting treated. So 28 million American adults with a mental illness are not getting treated. Can you imagine 28 million people with a broken arm or a heart condition not getting treated? It's unthinkable. And at Otsuka, and this is why we believe what we believe strongly in the value of every mind. And that is why everything that we do is focused on fighting to ensure that individuals with mental illness get the same kind of care, treatment, attention, and focus as those with any other disease. So what I want to do is turn over to my colleague Eli. You work every day, Eli, with the patient advocacy community. We've talked about how the national conversation is shifting. Tell us what's happening at the individual level. What is working? What's going well? And what more do we need?
Thank you, Debra. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So the first point I want to jump on is, and Gabe's not here now, but I'm going to share something that he shared with me because he's done a lot with regards to educating myself and my colleagues with regards to mental health, mental illness. And the one thing I want to point out is we're using these terms today, mental health, mental illness. Hey, Gabe. What I want to point out, though, is that I think we need to be clear on the language and what we're talking about. And it's great that on the national level, there's a lot more recognition of the importance of mental health, that we all have mental health that we need to care for. But it's also very important and much more important to understand the impact on individuals living with mental illness. Mental illness and mental health are not exactly the same, and sometimes we conflate them together. When we do that, and this is something that Gabe shared with me, during COVID, it impacted everyone profoundly. It impacted individuals living with mental illness very differently. And one of the things that Gabe shared with us was the idea that we have to raise the urgency on reaching these individuals. The supports that they need are very different, and we need to understand that uniqueness to living with mental illness versus caring for your mental health. Both very important, but we have to understand the differences between mental illness and mental health. So that's one thing. The other reason we need to separate these is when you look at even mental illness, you have to dig even further. They're not just all one disease state that you lump all together and you call mental illness. There's so many different conditions that individuals are living with, and we need to understand that. They're each unique. They bring their own challenges. They bring their challenges with regards to symptomatology. They bring challenges with regards to level of insight an individual might have into their disease. It's very different with regards to supports that an individual might need to receive, depending on their mental illness. And so we need to understand that. We've seen many times individuals who are misdiagnosed, and just the additional pain, emotional, mental, that can bring when you don't have the diagnosis correct. So it's very important to understand that these are very different disease states, conditions, that need to be fully understood, and the individual needs to be understood. What are they trying to accomplish in their life? Where are they? What supports do they have? And so it's important to really dig deep and understand each individual, what they're living through, what their challenges are, and how best to meet them where they are.
Thank you for going there, because it feels like we shouldn't have to say it, but mental illness is not monolithic. And the idea that people think it is or don't understand it well actually the misunderstanding ends up being a barrier to getting the care, to people reaching out and getting the care that they need. So that's, I think, a really critical point. I just want to add in a couple of other barriers that, again, we talk about, but they're worth underscoring. One, and you heard it this morning, is kind of workforce shortage and the fact that people just don't have access to a provider. I think Representative Trone said it, but half of the U.S. population lives in a workforce shortage area. We talked about, and I had looked at this, they're estimating one mental health provider for every 350 individuals. That doesn't make any sense. And the problem is even worse, obviously, in rural areas of the country. 65% of rural counties don't have one psychiatrist in them. What do people do when they need care? Where do they turn to? I would also just add very quickly, besides having a provider to turn to, we know that another very big barrier, and we talk about it a lot, is the stigma and discrimination and the issues of the fear of being ostracized or treated unfairly because of a mental illness. Stigma is influenced by cultural beliefs, by attitudes, by values. So it's at that community level where we need to be doing the work to try to address stigma. I do want to give a shout out, because it's nice for us to identify good things that are happening, to the work that CMS, for example, and others are doing to try to integrate more community-based services because of the issues around stigma and discrimination and other things into the integrated care model. That is really, really critical, and we need to see more of it. the point here is that these services, these things are not nice to haves, they are things we have to have. So I guess I wanted, they're critical to the success of what we're trying to achieve here. Again, based on the experience and the people you're talking to, what types of support? Can you be specific about the kinds of support and initiatives that are working, and where the gaps are, what we can do about it?
Absolutely. So in the work that I do, connecting with the community, and that includes healthcare professionals, that includes patient advocacy organizations, individuals living with various mental health conditions, a few things really pop up. One is the power of the peer, right? The idea of having an individual who has walked down a path, come alongside a family who honestly feels lost and don't know what to do. Being able to have that peer come alongside them and help guide them is tremendously powerful. Healthcare professionals, definitely a workforce shortage. And also those that are there are working under tremendous constraints, time, other constraints. And so being able to have a peer come alongside when an HCP can, or a healthcare professional can't spend that time that they want to with a family, connect them with a peer. Have that peer come alongside them, guide them. Related to the power of the peer is the power of advocacy organizations. And I see Dan Gillison there in the back, and have attended meetings with NAMI. And all too often, and we've heard this from other groups, the idea that their members, folks who have come to them, kind of speaking out on the fact that I wish I would have known about you 10 years ago. My life would have been so different. That needs to change. And so with that workforce shortage, those constraints, why not refer that family to an advocacy organization? There's power, there's education that can take place there that the HCP can't deliver. And so there's power in working with advocacy organizations. Transitions of care, back to the peer, being able to transition from, we know that our system is broken and there are too many gaps where folks are falling through the cracks. Having a peer there who can help that transition of care take place in a way where there's continuity, questions are being answered, that family knows what to do, there's power there. Goal setting, I think, is a huge need with regards to learning. HCPs rightfully focus on symptoms and how to address them, but what else is the individual working towards? Let's come up with a plan that takes those goals into account, those individual goals, in order to make sure that the supports, the treatments that are being considered help that individual get there. And last, I know we're running short on time, but I do want to share with regards to care partners, care supporters, caregivers, whatever you want to call them. It's very different, based on kind of the disease area, the condition, with regards to that level of support. But we know that the impact on that other member is profound, and so their needs need to be taken into account as well.
Thank you. I mean, the truth is there is so much to talk about here, which is why I'm glad we're having this conversation today. We appreciate everybody who is with us and who is offering their perspective and working hard on this. We too are joining you and are committed, even more committed than ever, to try to advance the conversation, support the right kinds of solutions, continue to do research and development and bring innovative solutions to individuals who need them. And we look forward to the continued conversation. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now please welcome back Bob Cusack, who is joined by panelists Dan Gilson, CEO of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Susan Gurley, Executive Director of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and Colorado State Senator Daphna Michelson-Janae. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for being here. Why don't we start off going down the line, Dan, starting with you, as far as your passion, why you're here, a little bit about your affiliation as well, and your group.
Bob, I almost feel like I'm a moderator too.
Well, then take over, please.
My passion. But first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for hosting this, because this is a very important conversation and we've got to change the narrative. Who I represent is NAMI, the largest mental health organization, grassroots mental health organization in the United States, with over 650 organizations in communities across the U.S. So we're the DNA in the communities that Gabe spoke to, a woman that reached out to him. Many of our people are volunteers in the communities that are doing that outreach. Nothing about us without us. Our community is a representative of lived experience, and that's where we start, and often that's where we continue. In terms of our work and what brought me to this work is that I lost my contemporary. We were to be the first to go to college. We were the role models for our younger siblings, and we grew up together. And she lived with major depression. She was working, gainfully employed, and she lost her life to suicide. I saw the ripple effect to what that did directly to my family, and the repercussions are still being felt, and that happened in 1986. So at this station of my life, it's an opportunity to give back and to make a difference, and that's what's brought me to this work.
That's powerful. Daphne?
So I thank you very much for having me. It's a little hard to tell my story. I wish I could do it as well as Gabe.
He was pretty good, wasn't he?
He was really good. He was amazing. Round of applause for Gabe.
Very nice.
My son attempted suicide when he was 9 years old, and he was in the 4th grade. And he had been talking about suicide since he was 6 years old and wanting to die. He didn't know the word suicide, but wanting to die since he was 6 years old. And all of the doctors that I took him to said, don't worry, 6-year-olds don't die by suicide, 7-year-olds don't die by suicide, 8-year-olds don't die by suicide. And when he was 9 years old, he said, let me show you. And, you know, as a parent, going through the process of helping my son through his mental health challenges and his mental health disorders, I realized and recognized, you know, there weren't services available. And even though I had great access, as a matter of fact, I worked at a hospital at the time that had a children's unit, and I couldn't get my son the help that he needed. I knew that there were more out there. And at the same time as I was trying to get my son the help he needed, which turned out to be part emotional and part educational, you know, there are two sides of a coin. He's twice exceptional. Of course he's exceptional because he's my child. But he's also exceptionally learning disabled. So learning to find out about his pathway. I was volunteering at 2 of our juvenile correctional facilities in Colorado, and one a boys' facility and one's a girls' facility. And I was working with the boys through junior achievement on a popcorn project. It was very exciting. And I realized the boys were just like my son. And I made a joke the next day to a friend, I'm looking at colleges for my daughter and prisons for my son. And I realized it wasn't very funny. And I had to do something. And so I ran for office, and this is my major platform.
And we'll come back to that because I have some follow-ups on how you translate that into public policy. Susan.
So I'm a lawyer by profession, and I've always been interested in social justice issues. And as many of you have spoken about, many people who are incarcerated and have issues suffer from mental illness. So I thought joining the Anxiety and Depression Association of America would be a wonderful opportunity for me to figure out how I could be part of the solution. And alas, as many of you have seen and discussed, we haven't done enough to solve this issue. And I also wanted to follow up on what Eli said, and one of the things that we at ADA really talk about. I'm glad we used the word mental health. But mental health really, it's kind of a sexy term. It means everything and nothing. It's like buying a new dress. And we at ADAA talk about the specific disorders: anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, and co-occurring disorders. Because each of those means that you may need different therapy, different medication, different help. And I personally, and this is my personal opinion, feel that we feel so good about ourselves saying that we are talking about mental health. But by not really defining it, it makes it very easy not to do anything about it. So at ADAA, we are very committed to using words correctly. I think that's really important. And ensuring that every patient has access. And then I'll stop with my other screed. And the biggest thing is there's not enough therapists. So here we have talked about we are destigmatizing and we are pro-mental health. And then you finally realize, yes, I agree, I need help. And where do you go? Nowhere. So then you feel even worse about yourself. So thank you for talking about mental health and not ensuring that there's enough health care and access to care. So unless we do both, this conversation, in my opinion, is absolutely meaningless.
Well, you definitely put your finger on a major problem. How do we fix it? How do we address it? How do state and federal policymakers invest so that down the road, I mean, we're looking at major healthcare shortages from a worker perspective that's only going to get worse at the current rate.
Including people who should look like the patients they see. So if we improve the salaries, ensure there's maybe more debt relief and open up the schools and ensure that there's more social workers and therapists and give them, I don't know, we have enough money. We're one of the richest countries in the world. There's Harvard and Penn, they have more money than some countries in their endowments. Give more money in scholarships. Make that a priority for America to ensure that there's enough people trained in mental health. We say we have a war on drugs. Why don't we use that same resources and say we are going to use those resources and ensure that we have enough people who are trained to provide mental health services all through America? Why should I, privileged, live in Washington, D.C., have more access to more therapists than somebody who's living in a state in Utah, Puerto Rico, or wherever else? It's unfair, or that there's not enough people of color who are therapists. Mm-hmm. Where are those people being able to serve? So I love being here. I'm glad we're talking about mental health, but I'm like, let's talk about nuts and bolts, resources. Resources, resources, resources. And then we can address the mental health crisis. As you can see, I'm on a screed.
But it's a smart one. Daphne, what do you think about that?
Well, I can tell you from my work in Colorado, from the Colorado perspective, I've been trying to answer that question. And one of the challenges is, how do we get people to the right level of care at the right place at the right time? Right now, we treat mental health like this. Say you go to the doctor and the doctor says you have high blood pressure. Give me a call when you have a heart attack. That's how we treat mental health. So, oh, you look a little bit down. Let me know when you're feeling suicidal, and I'll do a suicide assessment, and then we'll try to find you a doctor, which is going to be impossible because you're in crisis, and it's hard to find anything when you're in crisis.
Sure.
So I put 2 laws into place. One is annual mental health wellness exams. We're the first state in the nation to require insurance companies to cover annual mental health wellness exams. And that has a long list of mental health providers who qualify to give you an annual mental health wellness exam, from a drug peer specialist to marriage counselors to child psychiatrists. You know, you can pick who you want to go to for your annual mental health wellness exam.
And you would just pay a copay?
0 copay and 0 co-insurance.
0 copay, wow. Very impressive. Okay.
So it is a 45 to 60 minutes with a qualified mental health care provider for 0 copay, 0 co-insurance at any stage in your life, from the moment you're born till the moment you die. So annual mental health wellness exams. Now we have to get the word out about them. But if you start checking in on an annual basis on your mental health, and you're checking in with a social worker, you're not pulling from the psychologists. You're not pulling from the psychiatrists. So if we have fewer psychologists and psychiatrists than we do have social workers, then the balance gives in and we have maybe enough people. The second law that I put into place was the imattercolorado.org program. And iMatter Colorado is free therapy for any school-aged youth who wants it in Colorado, no matter where or if they go to school. So you go to imattercolorado.org as a teenager, and 12 years old is the age of consent in Colorado. So from 12 years old on, you can go onto this website and fill out a 16-question questionnaire that will then come back to you and say, hey, we think you're doing great. Here are some coping skills and ways to continue doing great. Come back anytime. 2 is we think you could really benefit from a therapist. Here is a list of all of our therapists and kid-friendly bios for you to select one of our therapists, and by the way, all their availability. So there's no waiting. And 3, we think you're in crisis, we're connecting you to the crisis hotline now. So it's three comebacks when you fill out this form. And we have served 8,500 youth in Colorado in a year. 60 of the 64 counties were reached. And a part of that is because it's primarily telehealth, it's also in person, but it's also in English and Spanish. So we have a lot of monolingual Spanish-speaking families in Colorado, and this is access to have therapy in your native language.
Which is very important
Very
as far as, and you, just as a quick follow-up, you said you've got to get the word out, right? Because you got to tell people about it so they can take advantage of it.
Right.
How many people are taking advantage of it? I mean, obviously that's a big marketing campaign.
So we ran the numbers, and our numbers did not increase between 21 and 22 in terms of people taking advantage of annual mental health wellness exams, the codes. So we pulled by the codes. So we desperately need to get a public-facing campaign out to let people know that this is an option and why it's important to take care of your mind like it is to take care of your body.
No, that's great. Dan, I want to talk to you about your association recently launched a new teen and young adult helpline. Can you tell us about that and its effect? Because that's what we spend a lot of this morning talking about kids.
I'm actually wearing a little bracelet for the helpline. We say nothing about us without us, and we have a national helpline. And one of the things about our helpline is before COVID, it was brick and mortar. It was tethered to being in an office, and we had volunteers that we trained, but they would come in, volunteer to actually be on the helpline. When COVID happened, we had to take it into the cloud. What has that allowed us to do is to actually train people across the country to actually work on the helpline. So we now are able to expand our reach and our services. The teen and young adult helpline is that, we created, I heard David Trone, I think, speak about the next generation. And what was interesting about that was that Representative Trone was that we've created a group called Next Gen. And as we looked at that, and this is a Next Gen group of about 21 to 25 year olds, and I'm going to the teen helpline, but where I'm going with this is as follows. We created that to actually have nothing about us without us, and we knew that young adults needed to have a voice. And they said, don't patronize us, don't have us up on a dais, have us involved, have us at the table. So we put out, over 30 days, we put out an application process. We had 760 young people apply for 10 seats to work with us for a full year, informing our work going forward. And we've done a great job with that. We took that and we asked that group, what are we not doing? And they said, you need to have the teen and young adult helpline. You need to have our voices. We actually had some callers call in and said, I don't want to, they could tell by your voice that you were, I guess you can say, in my age group. And they said, well, I want to talk to someone younger. So we got the feedback. We went back to the Next Gen group and validated, asked them, and then that's why we created it. And we just launched it last week. And we're very excited for what we know it's going to do for us. And it's directly from feedback from our Next Gen group.
And for people watching, how can they get in touch? What's the number? How do they get in touch? Do they go to your website?
They can go to our website, NAMI.org, or 1-800-950-6264.
Okay, very nice, very nice. I also want to follow up on what we were talking about earlier as far as kind of the breaking news that the Senate is going to follow the House's lead. That doesn't usually happen on a lot of things, especially on fiscal matters nowadays. But what do you know about that? Because I hear you were you have some intelligence on this.
Yes, yes. It's been in the works for a number of years, and really want to congratulate the advocacy teams at NAMI and AFSP. And what I know about it is that it is a bipartisan caucus group that has 4 representatives, but it's actually been built out to 10 now, 5 Democrat, 5 Republican. How they've come to that, it was launched on yesterday. So yesterday morning was the press conference, last night was the reception. And what was so interesting is the conversation about what mental illness does not look like. It doesn't look Republican. It doesn't look Democratic. It doesn't look independent. It looks like all of us watching and all of us in the room. And the biggest part of it for me was it was long in the works, and now what we see is a tone. I like to look at it as leadership, and thank you for your leadership, what you're doing, Senator. Leadership, tone, and execution. What I found was the tone and the temperament from these leaders is they are really all about execution, bipartisan execution. So, and they're getting to work right away.
And what are their priorities going to be in this Congress?
First of all, the first soundbite from Senator Padilla yesterday was about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and the implementation of it. What he said was, and then also Senator Tillis said the same thing, before we look at new legislation, let's make sure we're doing something in terms of operationalizing the legislation that we have.
Right.
So that was the first piece. And then they're going to look at some new legislation in terms of some opportunities in communities. But the first part they want to do is seek first to understand what we already have and making sure that it gets implemented at the state level.
Susan, we were talking a little bit backstage on how words matter and of how people who have mental health conditions, it's difficult, especially if there are language barriers. But also if the terminology is just not comprehensible to them. What's the key there?
So thank you for asking that question. ADA, we've worked very hard in ensuring that the language and the information we provide is health literate. Not everybody is as equally educated in this country, and the information that we provide is for free. So we view ADA almost as an entry portal for people who are looking to learn more about mental health issues. So for example, we try to explain, we throw these terms around therapists, CBT, ACT, all of these terms. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I don't know how many of you know all the terms. That I forget them. I'm like, so we actually write it out and say, this is what it means, and ask your therapist, what are the therapeutic models you are thinking about using? So we try to educate the consumer so that they feel comfortable when their providers use certain terminology. Or let's talk about medications. I'm a big proponent that if there are good medications out there, one should take them. But we try to also give the patient information and questions that they can ask in a way that they don't feel insulted in how we're putting them in words. Because as we know, the terms of these medications, do any of you know what they mean? And then 500 different things that can cause you. We just want the patient to feel comfortable in saying, what does this new medication do? How does it impact other medications I may be taking? How does it impact the therapy that I am using? And just giving the consumer information in a way that is digestible so that they are not overwhelmed with jargon. And going back again, which we've all talked about, mental health, mental illness. People suffer from specific disorders. We have to use the names of the specific disorders to ensure that we provide the people who suffer with the right help. And that is critical, and that's why we're all here. But thank you for asking my
No,
favorite
no,
question.
no,
I
that's a very
appreciate it.
good- that's a very good point.
I'm sorry, I love that question. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Please thank our panelists for joining us today. Hey, thanks, Bill. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joshua Gordon. He's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Please welcome Dr. Gordon. Hey, thanks for joining us. So, Dr. Gordon, tell us about your agency. I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with it, but maybe people watching online, not so much.
So I am the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. As you mentioned, this is the principal federal agency responsible for funding mental health research. We're one of the 27 institutes and centers of the National Institutes of Health, and we're the largest funder of mental health research in the globe.
And you have been the director since 2016.
That's right.
What has happened in those years?
Oh my.
A lot, right? And a lot of challenges in those years.
A lot of
honestly.
challenges and a lot of successes. Of course, you know, we've experienced a number of challenges to the nation's mental health between the pandemic, the upheaval around George Floyd, and lots of other things. And we've all experienced that together. We've all had those mental health impacts. In terms of progress in mental health research, just in those last 7 years, we've seen the adoption of coordinated specialty care for first episode psychosis in over 300 clinics throughout the United States, serving thousands of individuals. We've seen the FDA approval of 2 novel therapies, for 2 novel medications for depression. We've seen expansion of services in a variety of areas. It might sound Pollyanna-ish after what we've just heard, and I don't mean to be that way, but certainly we have seen a lot of progress in research in those 7 years.
How does it work with all the different 27 entities and coordinating government and response and implementation? How do you do that?
Well, at NIMH, our role is research primarily, but we also have a responsibility to try to make sure that research meets the public's needs and is adopted and implemented. We do that in a variety of different ways. First, on the research side, we do work with the other 26 institutes and centers to make sure that we're not studying mental health in isolation, but in combination with other forms of health, whether it be around substance use, alcoholism and alcohol use disorders, cardiac health, et cetera. So we make sure to try to integrate our research in those ways. When we talk about, though, having our research reach people who need it, that's where we try to work with a broad variety of other organizations, some of whom have been represented here today on this stage, like the National Alliance of Mental Illness, where we've formed, they helped us form a public-private partnership for drug discovery and schizophrenia. We work with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is responsible for funding those coordinated specialty care clinics to make sure they're using evidence-based approaches there. In fact, we have a learning healthcare network we formed with them so that those clinics can learn from their experiences and figure out what's working and what doesn't work, where our researchers are embedded in those clinics, getting data from those patients and sending it back to the clinic so the clinic knows what works. We work with the FDA, CMS, et cetera, to make sure that evidence-based approaches can be approved and can be supported. So a lot of different interactions with different federal agencies.
Well, speaking of what works and what doesn't, what have you seen in research trends? What have you noticed that would be, for people here in the audience and watching online, that you've seen, wow, that's interesting?
Also, man.
A lot of stuff, right?
A lot of stuff. Let me tell you 3 things.
Okay.
One, from a neuroscience perspective, obviously mental illnesses, they're instantiated in the brain. Yes, lots of things in our society, in the environment affect it, but they're instantiated in the brain. And we've made just dramatic progress in the last 10, 15 years on understanding how the brain works. Just last week, 24 papers from a giant consortium funded by the NIH Brain Initiative, which is one of those collaborations across institutes, has revealed that we have over 3,000 different brain cell types. And not only revealed that we have those types, but demonstrated their complexity, demonstrated their function, and provided the tools where we can then go ask how do those differ in individuals with mental illness as compared to individuals without mental illness. And also with specific diagnoses, thank you. I think that is important too. So that's one. Another thing, let's talk about suicide prevention, and in particular youth suicide prevention. So when I came on in 2016, we recognized, as was said earlier, that suicides have been rising over the last 20 years, really inexorably. And they continuously from 2000 to 2018, we saw a dip for 2 years, and now they're rising again. So what can we do from a research perspective? Our research had shown already by 2017, 2018, that universal screening in healthcare situations, particularly emergency rooms and primary care, can double the number of people at risk that are identified, and then appropriate levels of follow-up can reduce that risk by 30%. That was all in adults. So we've now advanced that to move that into adolescents and children to show that universal screening can also work in children and adolescents. And then again, we're developing digital approaches to providing suicide prevention therapeutics that can better reach kids. So that's one trend that I'm seeing. And the third one is really a trend where we're trying consciously to push. You know, the Biden-Harris administration released their report on mental health research priorities several months ago, and that was developed in concert with NIMH and a number of other federal agencies. But one of their cross-cutting priorities is in mental health equity. We recognize that in order to address issues of inequity in mental health, which are rife throughout our society, we need a better understanding of the social determinants of health, and we need interventions that are tailored for minoritized communities and rural communities and others suffering from these disparities. So that's been a real push over the last several years to try to develop the cadre of researchers who can do that in terms of developing training programs specifically for them, as well as diversifying our research workforce, because we've come to see that it's researchers from those communities who want to go back in, understand that problem, and develop solutions for that problem.
Has that been a positive coming out of COVID? We talked earlier about telehealth. And what are some of the solutions to reduce some of those disparities, whether it be racial disparities or rural areas?
So telemental health is absolutely key. One of the good things about NIMH research is we had been spending over the last 15 years a great deal of effort supporting research that showed that mental health delivered over the telephone, over video conferencing, and through digital apps can be as effective as in-person mental health if delivered with an evidence-based approach. That was ready when the pandemic came in 2020, and virtually everyone in mental health shifted immediately to telehealth. So we knew that it worked, and people were able to apply those evidence-based principles in the real world. One quick example with regard to equity. Researchers had been studying that transition, particularly in California, and showed that mental health care delivered via community-based mental health clinics, and these are federally funded clinics, which reach minoritized populations, underserved and poor populations, was effectively driven so that indeed telemental health not only replaced previous levels of mental health visits, but actually mental health visits during the pandemic increased, even in these underserved communities. Now, it's not perfect. As was mentioned earlier, many individuals with limited means have limited access to broadband. And so we found that in these federally qualified healthcare centers that are providing mental health, much of that remote care was via telephone. Fortunately, we know that works, but it may not be as ideal as video conferencing, which requires the greater broadband. So that's just one example of something good that came out of the pandemic. The other thing is not necessarily good, but it's helped inform our research approach. As we knew from disaster after disaster that preceded the pandemic, those with limited means, those in minoritized communities, those with poor access to mental health care are also the most affected by any emergency, and that was absolutely true during the pandemic. But the other thing that we learned from that is that social supports instituted by states and local communities helped stave off the worst of that pandemic. We did not see suicide rates rise in the general population through the pandemic. And one of the reasons we think that might have worked based upon research that's been happened so far is that there was a tremendous social welfare response in terms of easing the rules on continuing cash payments, easing the rules on food supplements, the ban on evictions that happen in many communities throughout the United States. These based on our research that NIMH supported, seem to stave off the worst.
It came up in a couple conversations earlier how we have an aging population in this country, and there are workforce issues right now. What's the solution there?
Put very, very simply, we need to train, as was mentioned earlier, we need to train more mental health care providers, and specifically in the geriatric population. The highest rates of death by suicide, yes, death by suicide amongst youth is tragic and rising very rapidly, especially minoritized youth. But the highest rates of suicide are in the middle-aged and elderly.
And that doesn't get the attention it deserves.
No, and so we need care provisions, we need care approaches that reach the elderly as well. And we don't have enough. We don't have enough of those. I should mention, it was mentioned earlier about peers as one potential locus. NIMH has funded a lot of research on non-traditional healthcare providers. Much of it is actually funded in lower and middle income countries where our global mental health team has been supporting a lot of wonderful research. But those findings from those communities about the use of lay healthcare workers, about the use of peer supports, these have been brought back to the United States and are being studied in our communities where we have lower resources and challenges in access.
That was one of my questions about learning from, whatever works you want to copy, right? And America is very focused on America. But what can we learn from, well, it could be states, it could be different programs that we've talked about, but internationally? Other countries, are they leading the way? Are we learning from them?
Yes, in lots of different ways. We can learn from Great Britain, which decided to adopt cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based therapeutic approaches throughout their national healthcare system. And although there continue to be challenges of access, the rates at which people were getting evidence-based care dramatically increased with that move. We can learn from our studies in Africa, where we've shown that having a lay healthcare worker sitting in primary care providers' waiting rooms, they're not really rooms in many of these communities, they're benches outside of the clinic, and just talking to people can identify more people at risk. They have to be trained, it can't just be anyone, but identify more people at risk. We learned from our studies in Nepal that teaching providers methods to address mental health care problems isn't enough, but if you pair that education with experience, with conversations with people who've benefited from mental health care, those providers then became motivated more to offer that treatment and to deliver it more successfully. So we've learned a lot that we can bring back to the United States. And peer support in non-traditional healthcare providers is really just the leading edge of doing that.
What about new technologies? We're in the age of AI, which is exciting and also a little frightening, but also whether it's new technology, we talked about telehealth, new treatments. What do you see on the horizon?
I think there's a lot of promise in novel technologies, AI, digital therapeutics, for two different purposes. One is to help the problem of matching treatments to individual patients, otherwise known as precision medicine, right? And we don't have that operant right now in psychiatry. Those of you in the room who've received treatment for mental illness know that it's a trial and error process, right? But if we can learn enough about our patients, get enough data on them, then we can use these approaches to develop tailored approaches that really work for individual treatments. That's a major thrust of our research. So that's one way. Of course, delivery of digital therapeutics is another way. And so there are tremendous opportunities for apps and other approaches that can augment clinical relationships with care providers and that can deliver that care to remote settings, rural areas, lots of different approaches, and tailor it also to individual patients in communities that are hard to reach. Now, I want to distinguish those kinds of approaches from wellness apps, from mental wellness apps. It's really crucial from my perspective as a researcher and as someone who wants to see these things implemented in the real world, that we study these apps and demonstrate that they actually work for people with mental illness, right? And that requires a certain level of regulatory oversight. That requires that these tech companies invest in their products to make sure they actually work so that doctors, patients, social workers, therapists can provide care that they know is going to work for their patients.
Do they work now?
Thanks. There are a few FDA-approved apps for mental health care. There's a lot of evidence, and there are some countries, learning from other countries, Sweden, that have adopted some of these evidence-based approaches, built them into their national health care plans, and some health care plans in the United States that are using these evidence-based approaches, but there are far more approaches that haven't yet garnered that evidence base that we really need to do.
As far as connecting to people, has, in the wake of the pandemic, has the stigma improved? Because people have to say, listen, maybe I do need to talk to somebody, and getting to that point, and that's a difficult process.
So asking me as a member of the public, yeah, I would say stigma has improved, right? I mean, we've all seen it in our daily lives. I would also say that that stigma was on its way towards improvement before the pandemic, but the pandemic greatly accelerated that process. As a researcher, I have to acknowledge it's harder for us to measure that. Okay. And we're not 100% certain the degree to which stigma has improved from a scientific perspective.
So you haven't seen the proof of that necessarily?
That's right.
Okay.
Let me just say that one measure of proof is the higher rates at which people are seeking treatment, right? And those waiting lists that we discussed, that we've heard about, the fact that it's really hard to find a care provider, that's all been increasing over the last decade, despite actually an increase in the number of care providers. It's not far enough, but there's increased demand for services. I would argue that's one one piece of evidence for that decrease in stigma.
As a key government leader, for people who are struggling right now, what would you advise to them?
Seek help. And I understand that help may not always be easy to get, and that's our cross to bear in terms of policymakers. We need to find ways to improve that. But there's lots of opportunities to reach out to trusted friends, family members, clergy, teachers, healthcare providers other than mental health care providers, and also, of course, the 988 National Crisis Line now. There are lots of ways to get help or reach out for it.
What does the research show on hotlines and how important, obviously, and the 988 hotline, I think, and I was saying this earlier, is one of the best ideas that government created.
So there's really good evidence that hotlines are an accepted and acceptable way to reach out for care. There is decent evidence, but not thorough yet, that reaching out to a hotline can help.
Okay.
And we need more evidence, really. Where we really need the research is on the back end. What happens after someone calls a hotline? What are the best approaches to use to back that up? We have some evidence for things like mobile crisis teams. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that we need mental health responses to mental health calls and not law enforcement, or for that matter, even your typical EMTs, right? So there's some evidence for some of the things needed to back this up. One of the things we're excited about is the fact that different states are doing different things in response to 988. And so we have researchers who are studying those different responses to figure out what works best. And once we know that, then we can tell everybody, hey, of all the different solutions the different states have implemented, these are the things that we're seeing actually move the needle on care.
So it's interesting. The states have little different methodologies.
Yeah.
And then you study them, see what works, and do that.
That's right.
Anything I didn't ask that you wanted wanted to stress or any closing statement from this, I think, very important discussion?
Well, one thing, you asked it and I sort of responded, but not explicitly. You know, NIMH has been around now for 75 years. We're celebrating our anniversary. If you want to visit our website, you can, lots of fun events to go to. There's a myth out there that research hasn't made a difference for mental health care. And not to minimize the evidence that we have a long way to go, that we're not making a dent in suicide rates, that there isn't good access, that most people aren't able to get evidence-based therapies. We have made a lot of progress, and a lot of that progress is because of research. We have dozens of medications for each of our mental illnesses. They're not perfect, they have tremendous side effects, but they can help people achieve recovery. Each and every one of those medications has been touched by mental health research. Cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapies for everything from autism to OCD, they all have a basis in research, either funded by or conducted at the National Institute of Mental Health. And so I think we have to acknowledge that research actually does pay off. And the reason why it's important to do that is because if we don't acknowledge that, then there's no incentive for policymakers, for Congress, et cetera, to continue funding that research. And we won't have the great discoveries of tomorrow that rely on it.
We've run out of time. Please thank Dr. Gordon for joining us. Thanks so much. Hey, that was great. Well done.
We have now come to the end of our program. Thank you so much, Bob and Dr. Gordon, and all the wonderful speakers this morning. It has really been a very compelling and moving program. On behalf of the Hill, and our sponsors, Otsuka, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us here and online. If you missed any portion of today's conversation or you'd like to review some of it, it'll be available shortly on thehill.com. And thank you all for joining us today.